It was June 12, 1381. A restless crowd gathered on Blackheath, just outside London's walls. Tension hung in the air. England was in turmoil. This was the start of the Peasants Revolt, a moment when ordinary people demanded justice, and history shifted. In the center stood John Ball, a radical preacher. He raised his voice above the murmurs, asking a question that echoed through the centuries. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? With this, Ball challenged the entire English class system. His words struck at the idea that some people were born to rule and others to serve. At that time, the people rallying at Blackheath were mostly farm workers. They tilled the land, grew food, and worked hard. Yet they were often scorned by lords and church leaders. The word for these laborers was villains, but it did not mean evil, just a worker of the soil. The story of how villain lost its innocence is not just about language. It is about power, class, and the way words shape the fate of ordinary people. To understand this, we must look back, even before the revolt, to the roots of the word itself. Long before villain meant a wicked person, it simply meant a farm worker. In the fields of medieval England, a villain was someone who worked on a villa, an estate. These people grew the wheat and barley that fed the nation. Their hands shaped the land, season after season. But to the ruling classes, villain also meant lowborn. It marked someone as poor, rough, outside the world of knights and lords. Over time, the word picked up the flavor of disrespect. To call someone a villain was to say they were beneath you, even if they did nothing wrong. This turn in meaning didn't happen by accident. Words change because society changes. As England's towns grew and the rich became richer, old words took on new shades. Villain became a way for the powerful to look down on the powerless. In the end, villain would become a curse, a word for someone evil, not just someone poor. But before that, it was simply a name for the people who kept England alive. The journey of villain began in ancient Rome. There, a villa was not just a country house, it was a working farm, often owned by the wealthy. The person who lived and labored on that farm was called a villanus. This word had no stain of evil or insult. It simply described a job. As the Roman Empire faded, Latin words lived on. In many European languages, versions of villanus survived. In Old French, it became villain. In Italian, villano. In Spanish, villano. All of them meant the same thing: a peasant, a farm hand, a rural dweller. These words were neutral at first. They described millions of ordinary people whose lives were tied to the land. In the countryside, everyone knew what a villain was, and it was not something to be ashamed of. Yet even in Roman times, the line between city and country, rich and poor, was clear. As centuries passed, those lines grew sharper. Soon, villain would begin its slow turn from neutral to negative. In 1066, everything shifted. The Normans arrived bringing conquest, new rulers, and, well, their language. French words poured into English, especially those tied to class and land. Among them was villain, which still meant a farm worker, but now carried a sharper edge. The Norman feudal system divided people by birth and by role. Lords ruled from castles, villains worked in the fields. The French villain became a way to mark someone as common, even coarse. To be a villain was to be outside the world of courtly manners and noble blood. This bias was not just about words. It shaped laws, customs, and daily life. The church and the nobility saw peasants as less worthy, less educated, and sometimes less moral. As a result, their word for farmer started to mean bad character as well. In England, the line between villain and sinner began to blur. Language became a weapon, used by the powerful to keep the powerless in their place. After the Norman Conquest, villain became not just a word, but a legal status. A villain was a peasant tied to the land, unable to leave without permission. They owed heavy labor to their lords and had few rights. The law put them at the bottom, just above serfs. Stories and documents from the Middle Ages show the harsh world of the villain. They paid rents, performed unpaid work, and could be punished severely for disobedience. Their children inherited their status. The church preached obedience and humility for villains while promising heaven as a reward for suffering. In writing, however, the first time villain appears in English is not in a record book but in a moral poem called Handling Sin, written around 1303. There, the word describes someone sinful, not just lowborn. This shift from neutral to negative meaning was already underway. As the centuries passed, villain became a tool for shaming. The word for farm worker was now a word for bad person, reflecting a society where class and morality were tightly linked. Villain was not alone in its fate. Other words for common people also became insults. Take churl. In Old English, a churl was simply a free farmer. Over time, churl turned into a term for someone rude or mean. The same happened with boor, which once just meant farmer, from the Dutch boor, but now means someone crude. Even the word vulgar, from the Latin vulgus, meaning the common people, became a word for something tasteless or low. Lewd followed a similar path. Once it meant simply unlettered or common, but it shifted to mean dirty or sinful. This is not a random pattern. When the powerful wanted to set themselves apart, they used language. The words for ordinary folk became words for bad behavior. It was a linguistic way to reinforce social barriers and keep order. The history of villain is more than a story about words. It is a story about power, prejudice, and the shaping of society. By turning a word for farmer into a word for evil, the ruling classes rewrote the worth of ordinary people. The medieval church helped deepen this divide. Its sermons and writings often linked poverty and low birth with sin. The language of the church and the law worked together to keep peasants humble and afraid. This pattern repeats across history. Words for ordinary often become insults. Class, language, and control are tied together. Even now we feel the effect. The villain in a story is the enemy, the wicked one. But behind that word is a long struggle over who gets to be respected and who does not. To know the story of villain is to see how language shapes the world. It teaches us that words are never just words. They are tools of power, and their history can reveal who we are and who we might become.